Duncanville, MDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is October 2nd, 2020. And on this date in history, in 1948, Jonathan Lee Dugdale was born. That's my father. So if you see him on Facebook or anywhere else, make sure that you wish him a happy birthday. His birthday was yesterday, so you're late. Trying to do better next time. By the way, tomorrow, October the 3rd, is my brother-in-law Chad's birthday, my former student who married my sister, and he will be 36 years old. So if you see him, wish him happy birthday. Happy birthdays to everybody.
So the peasants revolt. So here we are in Germany, and there's a push by the normal people. And by the way, peasants doesn't always mean landless serfs or homeless people. This is everyone who's not nobility and not part of the church. So this is the large majority of the population. Well, they want to get social and economic equality. Okay, so they start this whole rebellion, and they think that Martin Luther is going to support him because of all the change he's trying to create. But Luther is actually going to call for the rebels' deaths. Okay, now this is going to bring us to an event, the Peace of Augsburg. Okay, so in 1555, German rulers made the decision that you could choose any religion as long as it was Calvinism or Lutheranism. And by the way, whenever I say anyone could choose, the kingdoms could choose their own religion. So the actual people could not. So you're kind of subject to whatever religion that your lord or king, or like a smaller king, not like a big like King of England, but whatever they wanted is what you were stuck with for that little kingdom. Okay, all of the German states had the same rights. Again, if you were look, Game of Thrones prequel trailer is now available. Thank you for that unsolicited YouTube thing. Thank you, YouTube. Anyway, so like I said above, freedom of religion was only for the leadership, not for the normal people. So Zwinglian reform. Ulrich Zwingli, okay, is a Swiss chaplain. A chaplain is someone they serve really the church in the military. They're kind of a spiritual guide, a counselor. They're not active fighters, okay? So he worked with a group of mercenaries. And because of the poor economics of the area, this had to happen, okay? Now, so he converts this entire Swiss city in Switzerland into this new form of Christianity, okay? So relics and images were forbidden in the city, so this is more of an attack on Catholicism than anything else. There was a new service of scripture reading, prayer, and sermons, and this was a little bit different than the Catholic Mass. So it was an attempt to remove Catholicism. And he was ultimately killed in a war between Protestant and Catholic states in Switzerland. So the Anabaptists, they believed that they were the true Christian church, and they're one of the big proponents of the separation of church and state. Now, this is something that will be embraced in Rhode Island by Roger Williams. For anyone who's wondering where that falls, that Roger Williams is about 100 years after that. Everyone that lived in this community wanted to be there. It was a voluntary community, and they'd all been baptized and had some type of spiritual rebirth. They believed in equality. They would not arm themselves, and these were really peaceful communities, but they are heavily persecuted by the majority of Europe at this time. So, by the way, tolerance or intolerance is not a new thing. It's been around forever. Intolerance was invented by Brad Intolerance, and I believe that was in the 2nd century BC when Brad Intolerance killed all of his neighbors because he didn't like, how loud they were and the way they dressed. And they're like, wow, you know, whenever his kid went into town, they're like, you know what? You're one of them intolerance kids. And they're like, what? What'd you call me? Intolerant? Oh, intolerance. I was like, yes, that's us. My father is Brad Intolerance. Such a good Roman name, Brad Intolerance. Charles V. Now, he is related to Ferdinand and Isabella. He rules Spain, but he also is in charge of Holland and the Holy Roman Empire. Those were all three separate nations, but they had one king between the three of them. Okay, and I mentioned last time we were talking about the Protestant Reformation that the reason that he wasn't able to go and smite Martin Luther to death was the fact that he was fighting a a Muslim army right outside of Vienna, Austria. Uh, Also, because he wanted the Pope to, basically declare a holy war and get everyone involved, and the Pope didn't work fast enough. So he goes into Rome in 1527 and he sacks the city. A group of German princes in the Schmalkaldic League oppose him, and they don't beat him. It's kind of a draw. It's just a long, drawn out war. Uh, Eventually, he's going to step down in 1556, but he rules for a solid 40 years, and he is probably one of the most successful Spanish rulers, which I don't know if that's a slap in the face to him or a slap into the face of all Spanish rulers. I mean, I don't know how great you think Ferdinand and Isabella were, and then you have Philip II was probably the better one. And it goes Ferdinand, Isabella, Charles V, and then Philip II. And then a bunch of meh people for a long time. Moving on. Okay, so Francis I of France. Okay, that's a lot of fr in a row there. Okay, uh, so he also is at war with Spain at the time. Okay, so you have the Spanish fighting the Muslims, and you have the Spanish fighting the French. The little war with France was another thing that kept him from stopping Lutheranism because he had to worry about a French incursion. Okay, Francis I made an agreement with the Pope that let him control the French clergy. Okay, if you remember, that was something in the Middle Ages that France had battles over. Who was in control of the churches and ministers and priests in France. And the Pope and Francis I, since Charles V was the ruler of three separate kingdoms, they came together and put together a treaty called the Concordat of Bologna. Okay, not Bologna, but Bologna, and this kept Charles V from becoming too powerful. Okay, and once again, I'm referencing this point that I was talking about earlier, and that was the Ottoman Empire, which has only been around for about 100 years at this. Well, no, actually, at the time of the invasion, it was about 60 years old, and there was a massive invasion under Suleiman the Magnificent. Okay, and in one of the battles, he kills the Hungarian king, and the Hungarian king was Charles V's brother. So if that shows you just how powerful Spain was at that one point, really one family had control over, you know, four countries. And I mean, I think everyone here knows, and if you don't, that the leaders of countries are super inbred. Like if it's a magical power, that's something that they have. At the Battle of Vienna is where Suleiman the Magnificent was stopped, and the invasion was stopped as well. So Henry VIII at one point protects the Pope And the Pope calls him Defender of the Faith, one of the highest titles that you can have. Okay? But the problems that Henry VIII runs into all have to do with his personal life. Okay? So Henry VIII had a very evil wife, Catherine of Aragon. She had six miscarriages, which he felt like were on purpose to shame him on the sight of the rest of the world. They did have one child together, and that was Mary. Okay, so since his wife, Catherine of Aragon, had disgraced him so and was so hateful to him, not giving him any sons, and you get if you don't get this, I'm being a little bit facetious here, a lot facetious, because it basically, he got away with the fact of just saying, hey, she decided that she's not going to be a good wife and give me a son. So he goes to the Pope and asks for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Now, if you remember back a few slides when we were talking about Charles V, that he sacked Rome and he had his armies in Rome. Okay, and as a result of him having his armies in Rome, uh, basically he could do whatever he wanted. Okay, so he has all of his armies in Rome, and whenever Henry VIII asked for an annulment to his marriage, and by the way, the Pope did give annulments if you're wealthy enough and powerful enough at the time, but Charles made him say no because the Queen of England at the time was Charles's aunt, Catherine of Aragon. Okay, uh, her parents were Ferdinand and Isabella, and so Catherine was the child of Ferdinand and Isabella and the aunt of Charles V. So they say you can't get divorced. Okay? So Henry VIII, I mean, in all fairness, does what anyone else would do. He decides to create his own church. Okay? Still a Christian church, but instead of the Pope being in charge, it's him, and he takes the Archbishop from Rome at that time, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop decides that he's going to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Okay, so uh, Henry then is single, and he's like, it's like I'll never love again. I'll never have a son. And Anne Boleyn walks up and she's like, hey, Henry, I'll give you a son. I'll give you a son real good. Okay, I'll give you a son right in the kisser. And he was like, wow, you're talking like a 1940s or 1950s actress. I definitely need to have a child with you. And so they get married and they have Elizabeth I. And Henry's like, you promised me a son. And she was like, well, just give me another chance. And he's like, okay. And he was like, what's that over there? And she's like, what? And then he chops her head off. You know, oldest trick in the book. Okay. So the act of supremacy is put in by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it rules that the king led the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. By the way, they still have those here in the United States. They're called Episcopalian churches, so they're pretty closely aligned to the Anglican Church. Okay, so part of this, and the thing is, you have to wonder, why did everyone go along with what Henry wanted? Well, this goes back to what happened in Germany. Okay, so uh, Henry dissolves all the monasteries and sells their lands and possessions, and gives a lot of land and possessions to the nobles and lords of England. And because of this, they will support Henry's claim to be in charge of the church, since he's not in charge of the doctrine, just the church itself. So everyone there is still able to practice. So, Henry is single again. So then he marries Jane Seymour, and Jane Seymour dies okay, of natural causes. Okay, then he marries Anne of Cleves. She doesn't get pregnant in 7 months, and he's like, you know what, I'm out. So then he marries Catherine Howard, and she gives him a child, but it's a sickly child, and that's Edward II. And he's like, well, we'll get back to him in just a minute. And then he marries Catherine Parr, and then he dies. Okay, So now Henry is dead, and they need someone to rule the country. Henry didn't have any brothers or sisters or a son. So what are you going to. Oh, wait, he did have a son. That's right. So this brings us to. Sorry, it wasn't Edward the Second, it was Edward the Sixth. Okay, so Edward the Sixth now is king. Huzzah! Okay, he's king for a very short period of time. Okay, so the Anglican Church during this time becomes a lot more Protestant. Uh, Edward is so sickly that everyone else around him controls what's going on, and the clergy could marry in the Protestant church, which would probably cut out a lot of problems in the Catholic Church. Not to take any shots, but actually, I guess that is a shot, especially since I called out that I'm not taking shots. I don't know. Peace. Oh, good. Ended all the problems. Anyway, so he died. They have to bring someone else into power. So they end up going with Mary. Okay, so Mary takes over as the new queen of England. And she is Catholic just like her mom was, and she's taken it personally that her dad not only divorced her mom but created a new religion to do that because he was so disappointed with the existence of Mary. So the first thing she does is she starts attacking and executing Protestants. 300 Protestants were burned as heretics. Okay? And so a lot of the nobility at this point is like, man, we don't want to be burned at the stake. If only we had some type of solution. So at that point, they decide that they're going to keep going in the same family because it's worked out so well. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but Henry VIII beheaded thousands and thousands of people. So his daughter's just like him, even though she doesn't want to be just like him. Okay? So this leads to. Oh, wait. I guess I'll hit this before I go on to Elizabeth. Okay? So John Calvin, he's a Frenchie. Okay? Uh, if I remember, his birthday was on 3/16. I'm always seeing people hold up those signs that say 3/16, and I was like, how do they know when John Calvin's birthday is? Well, anyway, so he fled France for Switzerland, okay, and he came up with a concept of his own in the Calvinistic Church, and that is predestination, and that says that before you were ever born, okay, before you were a thought in your parents' head, before you've done anything, God had already determined whether you're going to heaven or hell. So, uh, what you did really didn't matter because your destiny was already chosen for you. Okay, he created a church government called the consistory. Okay, and there was a court that oversaw all the morals and the doctrinal purity of the church. So if you were doing something wrong in one of these communities, they could arrest you. Like if you're cheating on your wife, you know, uh, if you're killing somebody or stealing from someone or I don't know, making graven images, they would, even dancing and gambling would get punishment. Okay. So basically, it's kind of like they had Footloose, the real city. If you're not familiar with the movie Footloose, you should see it. Uh, I remember one character in a movie called it the greatest movie of all time. But then Spider Man said no, it was never considered that. I don't know. Uh, so in Switzerland, in Geneva, Switzerland, really Calvinism becomes the main faith. Okay, meanwhile, back in England, Elizabeth I is like, oh, I don't have any rights. I'm illegitimate. Everybody hates me. And so all the nobles are like, hey, we didn't like how your sister was murdering everyone, but if you decide to become Anglican, we'll put you in charge of the church and in charge of the country. Otherwise, you're a disgrace and we don't want you anywhere near us. And she's like, oh, let me see. And she goes over and makes a T chart and like pros and cons of being queen. And eventually she decides, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay. She was legitimized in the act of succession, saying that, her parents' marriage was legitimate, you know, even though her dad, just like Things didn't work out in that marriage as well as her sister Mary. Okay, they no longer recognized saints in the Catholic Church, and there was about to be an invasion from Ireland. Okay, where the king of England, and that was Philip II at that point, was going to have her taken out and replaced by her cousin Mary Queen of Scots. So if you're watching that show on the CW about Mary Queen of Scots, she's going to be beheaded to death. Okay. By the way, Elizabeth I never was married. They called her the Virgin Queen because not because she was from Virginia, but because she did not make any sex. Although Sir Walter Raleigh might have said otherwise, if you believe all the rumors from the times. Okay, this is really one of the greatest times in English history. They call this time period the Golden Age. So, in 1588, like I said, the invasion from Ireland, the invasion from the Spanish. The Spanish sent their armada out. Okay, they're trying to replace Elizabeth I with her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who was more the it was more the other Mary's cousin than her own cousin. Well, anyway, so the Spanish sent out their armada, the most powerful navy in the world, to take out Elizabeth and take control of England. Okay, so Spain sends 130 of these ships. England cannot begin to match their ships, but they use things kind of like Greek fire and use their own ships to ram these Spanish ships and set them on fire. Also, a horrible storm, which was, I'm guessing it was probably a hurricane, came in and destroyed most of the ships, okay, of the Spanish, and really destroyed most of the ships of the English as well. But the Spanish Navy would never recover from this, and from this point forward, England becomes the most powerful naval power in the world. I think I phrased that really weird. England became the world's naval power for about the next 350 years. That's what I wanted to say. Okay, moving on. Okay, so social impact of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so you've got things like family and gender. Okay, so first, Lutheran ministers could marry. If you remember right, Martin Luther did get married. Okay, but women were no longer really included as part of the church. In fact, they were told that women should be at home, and they removed all the female symbols from the churches. You know, that whole mother of Jesus thing. Apparently, Jesus didn't have a mother anymore. All the women in the Bible, not really part of it anymore. Okay, yeah. So, education. There was a big focus on Bible reading, and that's something that's going to spill into the Americas, and at one point make uh, the United States the most literate nation in the world. Well, actually, first the most literate colonies in the world, then most literate nation in the world. Okay, Philip uh, Melanchthon called for basic schooling called gymnasia, and this is something that explodes into Germany, and it's probably a better educational system than what we have in the United States because around the between the sixth and eighth grade, they start to put you into a plan to teach you skills you need for the rest of your life. If you're someone who's really college bound at that point, they send you to a certain school or they send you to a trade school, or if you're a particularly good artist, they'll send you to an art school. And then from there, you'll get education based on that. And there's flexibility within those education, unlike the United States, where in Texas right now, you have to choose if you're going to be, an architect or whatever in the eighth grade. And then once you do that, you are stuck. It doesn't matter what happens. If everything burns down, you're going to be stuck in that program. For the social classes, a lot of reformers called for social equality, but that was something that was always squashed in most nations at this time. Now, in France, it will take hold and there will be a lot of death. Religious practices, they ended saints' feast days, okay? So you no longer had the big carnival and Lent, although these kind of things will come back over time. that brings us to the end of today's notes. And I want to thank everyone for being a good, completely silent, deafeningly silent audience. And other than that, everyone have a great day. I'll talk to you in 2 days. So until then, peace and be safe. Shalom.